Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for adramofOutlander.com for all things Outlander, from the Diana Gabaldon book series to the Starz TV series and anything interesting that falls between. This is podcast episode 166, and we're on week 2 of the Fiery Cross read-along. And this week we're covering chapter 2. But before we get there, I want to have one note about the TV series. So I did read the script for the season finale this week, and there were a few key pieces that didn't make it onto screen that were in the script. One being the integration by Jamie and Claire and young Ian into the Mohawk village. Claire reset or relocated a boy's shoulder, and that helped a little bit with credibility before we saw the stone. And the second thing that was missing is a whole section on Brianna asking about young Ian. Remember the bedroom scene where Claire went to go talk to Brianna? And basically what we got was, we're going to take you away from here and you're going to be with family, blah, 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 that stuff. That's when they were really talking about young Ian. And that didn't make it, which I think that was a pretty glaring thing to edit out. People noticed, like, why would Brianna not ask about our cousin? What the hell? So she did. It just didn't make it into the episode. And there was another scene with Murtaugh and Jocasta when they were still in bed. And Phaedra burst in to say that Brianna was in labor. There was no explanation in the script for why there was that weird disconnect about Brianna meeting her baby and knowing it was a boy. None of that. Just said she had a normal delivery, basically like what we saw on screen, a beautiful labor. And then Jocasta asking if she wants to see the baby. So I have no idea. It's weird. That was a very weird bit of stuff there. I'm like, that's a, All right. People had questions. Yes, people had questions. And the part, I just remembered, the other part was when Roger shows up and he said he went to the Standing Stones, but when he got there, he knew there was no way he could leave her, and he loved her. Like he's a fool, but not that big of a fool, or whatever he said. So they skipped part of what he said to her as well, which would have explained why he was so behind her parents. And yes, the intention in the script was for Murtaugh, as Jamie's godfather, to kind of be the stand-in, worried father figure outside the door when she was birthing. So, there you have it. So some key pieces that were just not there. And the gauntlet was a little bit different than what we saw on screen as well. Essentially, close enough. Okay. So the summary goes something like this. Breakfast is served, but not for Claire. Jamie desires an astrolabe. John Quincy Myers summons Jamie. A thief-taker threatens. Claire has a pop-up clinic. The unintended consequences of high taxes. A personal account of the riot is offered. So this is a pretty condensed chapter where the last chapters of Drums of Autumn really kind of went through days 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we see the dawn of the longest 24 hours on record ever in the history of books. No. So they must have been up around dawn. And at this point where we're starting in chapter 2, Loaves and Fishes, we're talking early morning still, because the sun isn't, she said this, by the time she gets back to the camp, the sun isn't even halfway up. So we're talking early in the morning. I'm thinking 7, something like that, maybe 8, where we start here. So they're still at Mount Helicon, which is Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina, and it's late October. So that is not the nicest time, but it is after harvest and getting everything ready for the next planting season, etc. So it's a pretty quiet time for everybody who has to run their homesteads. Okay, so who do we see in this chapter? We see Claire, Jamie, Abel MacLennan, Private Andrew Ogilvie. He's the young man who saved Germain from the water. Lizzie, John Quincy Myers, Fergus, Marsali, the MacGillivray family, the thief taker, and taxes. I think taxes are definitely a character in this chapter. So, in this chapter. And so Claire is trying to feed people. She's thinking about the goings on. Like, what does Archie have in mind for Jamie? What's going on? But what she also noticed is that at all the different campsites, the regimental soldiers are kind of spread between, and she thinks that this is twofold. He's very cunning about getting the soldiers to the different campsites, so they're going to hear a lot of information just by people talking, but also they're all from Scotland, and so hearing familiar voices has to be good for them and good for morale and make them feel better. In the beginning, Claire kind of stumbles upon Marsali and Lizzie and Fergus in the presence of this Private Ogilvie. And Fergus is trying to admonish Germain. We don't see Roger and Brianna. They're off doing wedding preparation things, we suspect. Who knows? They're off and about somewhere. And the issue with this Abel MacLennan is that he was part of the Hillsborough riot. And he's sitting at the same fire as this young Private Ogilvie. I remember Archie, who runs the regiment, wants information on any of the outlaws per Governor Tryon's order. So she has all these things going on in her head, and she's really concerned. And Jamie has borrowed supplies from Jocasta because they're trying to feed 20 people or something. So Claire has this big worry that Archie has something diabolical to talk to Jamie about, that Jamie's going to be arrested. I mean, Jamie is always sort of on the gray area of the law. He just skirts that really hard. So, of course, she's worried, especially seeing how people get hanged, all the other things that happen under the laws in the colonies, and what she saw him go through and knows what he went through in Scotland. So she's a little bit trepidatious here. And there's a lot more to worry about. They have that homestead with families moving into it. She has her daughter and grandchild and son-in-law here. So there's a lot more on their plate, along with Fergus, Marsali, and their children, etc. So the responsibilities are great at this point. So Jamie really tries to allay Claire's fears, okay? What did I even just say? Jamie tries to allay Claire's fears. Okay, there it is. And he explains that the Highland Regiment is disbanding. Not only is it disbanding when it goes back to Scotland, as soon as it can, there will be no more regiments at all in the colonies. So the colonies are really going to be left on their own. That's a big piece of information the king is really far away, and though the colonies were under British rule, each of what we now call states, each colony, had its own rules and its own governor. And so they were really run somewhat separately from the crown, except, of course, for the monies received and sent back, right? But now with the soldiers leaving and the crown not wanting to pay for them, that's a big deal. And so he doesn't think that Archie cares at all about the regulators, about the riot, about what Tryon wants. He just wants to get back to Scotland and do his thing. So that definitely helps. But he engages Private Andrew Ogilvie in this conversation. And of course, Lizzie and her 15-year-old hormones are like, oh, but why don't you stay a while? And Jamie's response to this is, we need to find her a husband. And Claire is shocked, which is so funny to me. Why things shock her at all, considering Marsali was married at 15. It's her 20th century values still popping up, and she can't quite get her brain around it. And Jamie's like, it is safer for this girl just to get married. And in the time, it's probably right. And even when Claire left and went back to the 18th century, young women got married between their junior and senior year, or they got married the week after they were out of high school. It was super, super common. So what's 2 or 3 years? And I would venture that a 15-year-old was considered much older than in the 20th century, certainly the 21st century. Like, people would think that, would be aghast at that now, where 40 years ago, it wasn't considered something very unusual. And just recently, laws were changing where 14-year-olds couldn't get married in the U.S. And in Colorado, the age of consent is 15. So for all your medical procedures, like, you don't have to tell your parents about anything. For taking medications, for any doctor's appointments, clinical therapy appointments, and they do have to ask permission to get married from their parents if they're under 18. However, the age of sexual consent is 15. So not really that different when you're looking at that. But I would venture to say that an 18th century 15-year-old was a heck of a lot more prepared for the rigors of life than most 15-year-olds in Western society are today. Like, it would just be madness. I mean, I look at my almost 21-year-old son and I'm like, you still don't like doing the dishes. I don't think you're ready for a companion quite yet. You know, you don't want to clean your room. So I don't know if you're ready for mutual responsibility of a marriage or a serious relationship. Anyway, so it's one of those things where we really, really have to step outside of our cultural mores and our cultural norms and look at the time frame and right or wrong how people thought. That's not really for us to judge. It's for us to look at and say, what was it like? What were the merits of what Jamie was saying? And why in the heck would Claire still be shocked? This is her second go-round in the 18th. She knows how things are. And the funny thing is Claire isn't this gigantic feminist. She does her own thing, her own way for herself, and she wants women to have choices. And she's a groundbreaker because of what she does, because she feels the need to do it. She's driven to do it, but it's not for external purposes. It's not for external cultural change. She just does it because she does it. And in her own time, she was very countercultural, hugely countercultural in the way that she did things and the way that she grew up, put her on this path of really just her own thinking, but it really wasn't about the external societal changes. Not as a drum beater. She wasn't going to go march for it. She was an example of it and what could be done, but she was also very traditional. I mean, Claire is all about the sexy time and all about pushing the boundaries and certain things, but for herself, if you notice when she talks to other people outside of a clinical way, she's very prudish about things, isn't she? She's always like, oh, you're like, Claire, come on. But it's because she is very traditional, and I think she's a very monogamous person. And when she partners, she fully partners, and there is an openness in that partnership. But Claire wouldn't have been out running around and like having sex with everybody and being like, free love. That's totally not her. And she likes being married. She likes that security and safety as she sees it. That's how I am. It's not oppressive for me to be married. For some people, it's a totally oppressive institution. And for me, marriage isn't about the law or the piece of paper. It's about the commitment and what we have invested in each other and our family. I don't need to be married at all. But I like being married, and I like having a companion and a partner. So I think that's very similar to Claire, except I'm not prudish about other people. I'm like, go get some good lovin', good healthy lovin'. That's, I want everybody to be happy. I think the sharing of oxytocin can make the world go round better, make people nicer. I'm pro oxytocin. Okay. So Lizzie becomes a flirt bomb, and she's embracing her womanhood, as it were. And this has Jamie very concerned. So Claire is going about this business of getting everybody fed, and then when a situation comes up, she runs off to see what's going on when John Quincy Myers shows up and gets Jamie. And then she goes through and starts to set up her pop-up clinic sometime in the mid-morning, it sounds like. It has to be, because the sun's going to go down earlier because it's late October, so it has to be somewhere like around 9 a.m. maybe. So all of this is taking place in increments of time. So that's really what her concern is. But along the way, they get to hear Abel MacLennan's story, and we really get to see the real-life application of the high taxes and the Hillsborough riot, and really a personal account of that. And it's pretty shocking and stunning, I think. So Jamie goes and gets supplies from Jocasta's tent, because their camp is a little bit off the beaten path. He has to go and get it. He comes back. That's what they're doing now. And he also plans on trading what he has left to trade, because this is supposed to be the last day of the gathering. And he wants all kinds of things, including an astrolabe that he wants to use. We don't know whether or not he gets it in this chapter, but I did put a link in to what an astrolabe is. We talk about a bunch of other things, too, that there are links for. This is a nice medical, science-y chapter that I'm like, ooh, look at that. Makes me happy. And Jamie ends up having to be a peacemaker and the king of men, fixer of all things. Now, there are a lot of men who were at this gathering who were also at Culloden, and they were in prison with Jamie, and they call him MacDoo, Seamus MacDoo. And he's expected to fix things. Okay. And John Quincy Myers shows up to summon Jamie into one of the funniest and most horrifying situations. It is amazing, and I am in love with Uta MacGillivray. She is fantastic. We'll learn about them in just a minute. And again, we get to see more of Fergus and Marsali's sort of life. Parent chaos. I think it's good that we see that. It's all not just glamour, right? And the whole MacGillivray family is the parents, the daughters, the son. And Uta is a renowned sausage maker. So, and then the thief taker. A thief taker is somebody who was acquainted with the formal police or the law and were legally able to bring in fugitives. So, it was very common in England, and they were kind of official, but not fully official, but they were allowed to do it. And I presume for payment that they would bring them in. But I put a link in for that. And so thief takers were big in the colonies, as well as an extension of the law. So they're not really bounty hunters where they're going to be able to make extraordinary amounts of money, but it is a living. And this thief taker has spotted somebody who was at Hillsborough and wants to take them to Archie to get turned in. And then the taxes. Again, we really get to see up close and personal what these extraordinary rates are causing and what they cause to people and why. Because the Hillsborough riot was an absolutely real event that occurred in history. So we do need to examine that. And I know in the United States, it's a very contentious thing right now. And people are fighting on social media about having a more socialized way with very high taxes like other countries where it's upwards of 70% personal income tax, or lowering taxes so people have more money to spend on what they want. It's a veritable melee on social media talking about that stuff. All right. So when we look at the things of note in this chapter, so the regiment disbanding is really all about Jamie's people being safe, because in Drums of Autumn, they actually were having people moving to the ridge, and the first people that they were getting were everyone from Ardsmuir that Jamie could find. I love that he's starting the ridge with people who were in jail, who were Jacobites. And he's got government-given land. And that's who he's choosing to put on there first, because they're trusted people. And the clans no longer exist. They're only in name, in the sense of you don't have a clan chief and you don't have that system anymore. But these are people that Jamie can trust by and large, and they trust him. But it's different. It's like when they were on the ship in Voyager, and he was like, these are not my men. They don't have to listen to me. They're not going to see me the same way, potentially. So he's trying to reduce risk by giving these people not only a hand up, he's surrounding himself with trusted people who he believes in and who believe in him. So safety for his people, because he knows several of those who took part in Hillsborough. We also know that Jamie has the foreknowledge about the American Revolution because Claire has told him. So he totally gets it. Lizzie's hormones. They're foreshadowing of things to come for her. She is boy crazy, 100% boy crazy. And eventually she figures out a path for herself that today is still considered countercultural and maybe not totally acceptable. I happen to love who she turns into as a character. I think she's amazing, and her spunk and she's like one survivor. Outwit, outplay, outlast. I think Lizzie deserves that award in books to come. Okay, the Hillsborough riot aftermath is really part of story building and foreshadowing. We really need to hear about that. Now, I know you're probably thinking that I complained about the in-your-faceness about the regulators in the TV series. Yes, it was a very real threat. It was a very real thing that happened. And it was huge in North Carolina history. It was the way it was portrayed in the series that was just so much. And here we actually get to see why it's important. And it's just not these taxes, these crappy people building mansions. You know, we get to see more of what it's really about. So the MacGillivray mix-up is what I'm calling it with the thief taker is one of the joyful bits of writing in this chapter for me. And John Quincy Myers comes to get Jamie, and there's this wonderful description of the man, what he looks like right now. And he definitely dresses like a mountain man, knows everybody. And so he comes and gets Jamie, friend James. So he takes him away from his breakfast, and he's needed at the MacGillivray site. And it has to do with one of the MacGillivray children. So Uta, the wife, who's German, she wants John to go get Jamie. She asks for him to come and help. And Robbie, the dad, is not going to allow his son being taken. And Robbie MacGillivray was at Culloden and was imprisoned with Jamie. So they have a close relationship. So this whole section is just fantastic. So we start seeing the people in the camp start disappearing. Fergus quickly hands off Germain and tells him that he needs to stay and protect his mommy because he wants to go see what's going on. And Claire just kind of leaves. Okay, so I have to, and then she boogies out of the camp and follows through the bushes to the MacGillivrays, who they don't really have a camp. They're just down in this section of the gathering for a specific reason. But they are all together. I love this little bit as Claire is making her way to where the MacGillivray party is, along with this thief taker, and the Highland Games are going on. The drizzle had started up again. The wetness gleamed on curving shoulders and plastered swirls of dark body hair flat against the pale skins of chests and forearms. I had no time to appreciate the spectacle, though. John Quincy threaded his way adroitly through the knots of spectators and competitors, waving cordially to this and that acquaintance as he passed. On the far side of the crowd, a small man detached himself from the mass and came hurrying to meet us. I love that. In this serious situation, like they don't know what's going on yet, but they know it's pretty heavy, that Claire, for a moment, is sad that she's not getting to stop and admire the competitors in the Highland Games who are shirtless. I'm like, oh, yeah, Claire loves the male form. Like, she just loves it. She appreciates it and its variety. I thought that was so funny. So they meet up with Robbie MacGillivray, and it is about his son. And a thief taker had spotted him, like I said, and wants to take him to Archie Hayes for the crime of being at Hillsborough. And we get to meet Uta first. And she's very suspicious, and she has a club in her hand when there's a rustling in the brush, trees. It's really funny. And in her broken German English, she doesn't know Jamie knows German. You know, she's trying to have conversation, and she sort of looks at Fergus and Claire and Jamie. Okay. So Jamie's introduced as Seamus McDo, Jamie Roy, and they end up all doing the pleasantries of meeting each other. I find that fascinating culturally of the time because they had to formally meet each other. They had to have a little bit of this few moments before they could get down to the business at hand. There was no rushing in and making it happen. I mean, to the point where Mrs. MacGillivray actually curtsies in return to Jamie, your servant, Mum. But he's wearing Roger's jacket, and he's got the blood stain from when Roger cut himself shaving. That looks a little bit, huh? Just kind of eyeing that. So we learn what is going on with the younger MacGillivray. He was there, and they're not really being totally forthcoming about what he did during the riot. Somehow he just ended up there, but he probably took part more than they're saying. But that's okay. That's Jamie's trying to figure it out. Like, Uta just wants to kill the thief taker, who happens to be being sat on by their 3 daughters. Their 3 teenage daughters she's trying to get married off. So the guy is trapped under the 3 girls, and he moves around. They kick him. And so Uta really just wants to, she's trying to figure out how to kill him the best way. And I'm like, oh my God. She wants to protect her son. And she will do anything to protect her children. And Claire's like, oh yeah, she would do it. Totally. So Jamie tries to get down to what's going on here. He's trying to figure it out. And we also learned something new about Robbie MacGillivray, who was at Culloden and Ardsmuir, that he won't kill anything, not even a chicken for dinner. Like, he will not harm another soul since Ardsmuir. That's amazing. So he's chosen to have a temperance of the violent part of his spirit that he had to utilize before, where Jamie is probably less trigger happy, but he has no trouble being a man of violence still. So the daughters are Hilda, Inga, and Senga. And Jamie has to get them to stop kicking this man that they're sitting on. And they're going around this whole scene. And I think this scene is so charming and devastating at the same time. Like, Uta's really, how do I deal with this? And they can't just let the guy go because they fear that, of course, he's going to go tell. And their camp is not even down where the gathering is. They were keeping to themselves. But one of the daughters is supposed to be marrying one of the competitors, and she has a very, very, very conservative would-be in-laws. And they would not like the fact that her brother was mixed up in Hillsborough, so if he gets arrested, it would bode very bad for her engagement. And if anybody saw Uta killing this thief taker, that would not bode so well either. So all of it is a bad situation. And that's really Uta's perspective, which is great. So finally Jamie gets to it. He's like, okay. They go through the different ways of killing, which makes me laugh. I mean, Fergus is like, you could use a knife and you can stab in the right spot. The blood isn't so much. The kidney just behind the ribs and back, eh? So they're strangulation, all these different ways. They're like, no, but if you're worried about the smell, because you release your bowels when you are suffocated or when you die. So they're going through this somewhat reasonably. Like, this is actually something that's okay. And she was thinking maybe butcher him like a pig. So they decide no. They get the thief taker and they go off to the side and they're having a conversation. And Jamie's able to negotiate the guy leaving without telling on the son. And they scared the heck out of him, telling him that she, being a renowned sausage maker, would butcher him and put him into sausage. And this totally offended Uta, who's like, I would never do such a thing. I would never ruin good sausage with this. So, Jamie was able to negotiate this. So we get to see his skills. He definitely has a way with politics and governance and managing people. He's a born leader, so we get to see that. It's all handled. And I think it's hilarious that John Quincy Myers gets bored with the whole proceedings. Everything is fixed. Here's exactly what Jamie said. Jamie Roy told him serious-like that it was surely luck for the thief-taker, his name's Bubble, by the way, Harley Bubble, that we done come upon y'all when we did. He give him to understand that if we hadn't, then this lady here, he bowed toward Uta, would likely have taken him home in her wagon and slaughtered him like a hog, safe out of sight. Bobble said as how he didn't believe it. He thought she was only a-trying to scare him with that knife. But then Jamie Roy leaned down close, confidential-like, and said he might have thought the same, only that he'd heard so much about Frau MacGillivray's reputation as a famous sausage maker, and had the privilege of being served some of it to breakfast this morning. Right about then, Bobble started to lose the color in his face, and when Jamie Roy pulled out a bit of sausage to show him... This was actually bad sausage that Claire had purchased the day before, so it's pretty funny. They were going to try and get a refund because the sausage actually wasn't edible. And then Myers says, and your husband, ma'am, bless his soul, Rob MacGillivray's a real born liar. Charms and solemn-like, agreeing to it all, shaking his head and saying, as how he's got his work cut out, to shoot enough meat for you. So there you have it. So they scared the wits out of the thief-taker. So no one's talking, and they're moving along. And Uta is really loving the size of Jamie, and she's just eyeballing him in a nice way, in a flattering way. And she's also looks at her own husband, who's a more slight man. He's handsome, but he's fine, and he's shorter than his wife. And she says, oh, well, love, you know. She sounded as though love were in an unfortunate but unavoidable condition. I glanced at Jamie, who was carefully swaddling his sausage before tucking back into his sporran. Well, yes, I said, I do. So Uta loves large men, but she fell in love with Robbie MacGillivray, so it doesn't matter. Love, you know. It's so great. So to me, this section here shows how Jamie cares for people, how he's clever at negotiating. He hasn't lost that skill. How he will take care of his people on the ridge. How, though he appears to be a government man taking the land, he really isn't. He's for what's best for his family and for the families that he serves. And Jamie really needs people to take care of. It is his calling in life. Some people aren't meant to take care of a goldfish, and some people are meant to be leaders and managers. And that's what Jamie is. He's meant to have these responsibilities, though they weigh heavily on him. He can't help himself. It's his natural born ability and really his need to do it. It's what drives him. Because he wouldn't do things simply for himself. He needs a reason. And these people, his people, are his purpose and his reason. So they finally make their way back to their campsite. And Claire happily has breakfast and coffee. Somebody made the coffee. She's super happy about that. And this is where she notes, we get the timeline. There was plenty of time. The sun was barely above the trees, almost invisible behind the drifting rain clouds. So she'd had a third cup of coffee and went to her pop-up clinic. And this is where some of the medicine stuff comes in that I found fascinating. And I put several links in for amenagogues and what she was talking about, as well as anthelmintic herbs, which are for getting rid of intestinal worms. Yuck. Such an unpleasantry. So she goes to her little pop-up clinic, and she goes in and she starts organizing it and seeing what she needs to restock, what she has to do, like refilling the alcohol bottle. So she's prepping her clinic for the day and brewing up herbals and tinctures, what she needs to do. So she talks about how she had gotten goods from Myers, who had brought her several things from the Indian villages. And she also traded with Murray McLeod. So he's an apothecary, so somebody who is a dispenser of medicinals, but also he's a physician. He's doing bloodletting, which is not awesome. It bothers her what passes for medical wisdom. I like the fact that she completely embraces herbal medicine because she knows it's actual medicine. And then so the weird kind of quackery stuff, like fleeming everybody for everything, she knows is wrong. And he set up shop right next to her. And for her, it was a way of maybe giving him some lessons and doing some passive teaching, because more people were coming to hire her for doing all the things that were coming to his side of his tent. And he really wanted to trade some of the things that she had. So she doesn't really care if he insults her opinions or not. And she was happy to give him her secrets, in air quotes, her secrets of medicinal ways in order to serve his patients better, so he wasn't actually harming people. And now she starts going through this mental list in her head, which is what she often does. And she has willow bark, which is pre-aspirin. It works in very much the same way for headaches and such. And then she goes through and she's looking at all the bottles in her chest, and she has amenagogues, and she's thinking about Lizzie starting her period. Now, amenagogues are things that help bring on a menstrual cycle. So, some can be considered abortifacients, where if you think you could be pregnant, you start doing it right away, even before you miss a period, to bring on your period. Or for women who, for some reason, they're not pregnant and they're not cycling normally. Like now we would put somebody on artificial progesterone to start a period. And now we have the morning after pill that is taken in order to stop a fertilized egg from implanting. Okay? So there are things that we do, but they're considered pharmacology. And since they are measurable and tested in different ways than herbals are, they're considered scientific. That's what we do today. And the herbals can be really quite dangerous, just like the pharmacology can be, if used at certain points in pregnancy or after a certain point in pregnancy. So to be very careful. But Claire was talking about blue cohosh, and there's also black, ergot, pennyroyal, rue, and blue tansy. All of those are used for making menstruation happen. And the other thing that she's thinking, okay, well, I'm going to do a gentle thing to help with Lizzie cramping and feeling terrible. And so some of these things can be used to calm. Like the tansy can be used as a calming agent as well. The other thing that she was thinking that she would throw in was the rue, which can help, which is an emmenagogue, but it's also anthelmintic, so it helps rid the body of worms. Yay! Yummy. So she doesn't think that that's what Lizzie has, but since so many people had them in this time, that it wouldn't hurt to put in her brew. Right? And so she also looks at Abel MacLennan and she thinks, yeah, he might need some of her hell brew as well. Because he didn't look so great. A little bit anemic. Just not quite right. So, this is what Claire's up to. And I did put a listing, and I will talk about, as we go down, a little bit more about the details of the Hillsborough riot and ergot, etc. Because we move forward into talking about Marsali nursing her baby. So she's sitting there and she just pops baby Joan on, and she's like, oh, sometimes that first 10 seconds can be brutal, and that's normal. It should subside. If there's actual pain, cracking, it hurts throughout the feed, then there's another issue going on, and lactation assessment needs to occur. But since Marsali does have cracked nipples, Claire starts thinking about what kind of ointment can be used. Sheep wool ointment, which is lanolin. And actually, today, we have learned that we shouldn't use lanolin on cracked nipples because it can hold the bacteria in and cause mastitis. That really what needs to be done for cracked nipples are things like any kind of balms that are safe for baby, like it could be coconut oil on there. There are some blends that are fine. You shouldn't put anything too strong. But just do wound management. Washing with plain soap and water, unscented soap, every day, letting air to the nipples, and really working on baby's latch, or see if baby has a tongue or a lip tie that needs to be addressed. All of those things. Just making sure that baby's getting on there good. But yes, for cracked nipples, so today, using lanolin is good for soreness if you're not allergic to wool, but not if there's actually any abrasion going on. And the part that coming up is, I think, very sweet. And this is why I put Marsali's cracked nipples are of note. Because Abel MacLennan is watching Marsali, and he gives her a fresh cup of coffee. And he says to her, "My own wife did say, as hot coffee eased the pains of nursing a wean. Whiskey in it's better, but all the same." Now, why do warm beverages help somebody? It's because they're relaxing. Now, you can get mother's milk, herbal tea, we call it, but it's an herbal infusion. You would have to drink like 2 gallons of that a day for it to really increase milk supply. What having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or putting whiskey in it, why would that help? It's because it relaxes the mother and it can help the milk flow and it's comforting. That's why. So I thought that was just so cute. And so she was freezing. So imagine being super cold, it's drizzly, and nursing a baby, and you have like owie nipples. Sorry, Marsali. So it's like a warm hug. So he was very smart in doing that. So she starts having this conversation with Abel MacLennan, and we get to learn about what happened and what the high taxes did to his family. So Mr. Hobson is going to be taking a petition to the governor about the taxes, okay? But Abel is not going with him at all, and he's not going back to Drunkard's Creek where he's from. So now he says that his wife is dead. Now, the Fraser clan has been spending time with Abel and he with them, and they had no idea his wife was dead this whole week. He hadn't brought it up. And she's been gone for 2 months, and Marsali is so sorry. And Jamie is so sorry. And now they start having the conversation. The taxes were so high that he had to choose to leave his wife to go and try and sell some goods in order to get enough money to come back and pay his taxes so he wouldn't lose his home. And it was very cold. So by the time he got back, the house and land had been auctioned off to someone else, and they told her she could take what she could carry, and that was that. And his wife was put out with no place to sleep, with only what she could carry. And when he returned, he found her sitting under the tree. He just missed her. Not long before he returned had she died. She was sitting under the tree that was next to the graves of their 4 children. And he didn't know if she just couldn't be without them or what it was, stubbornness. And she passed of the cold and probably of heartbreak with her 4 children's graves next to her. It is so terribly sad. So he was displaced. He has no place to go. His wife died. They'd already lost their 4 children. It's awful. And after that is right when the Hillsborough riot happened. And people just took up arms. And they just went into town. And he just got taken away with it. because he had stayed at someone's house and they were ranting and angry about these taxes and what had happened. And sort of in a dreamlike state that he was in, he felt numb, like he was already a dead man walking. And here's what he said. And so it was that when Joe Hobson had risen and announced that he and Hugh would go to Hillsborough, there to seek redress from the court, that Abel MacLennan had found himself marching down the road along with them, nodding and speaking when spoken to, with no more will than a dead man. It did come to me walking down the road, and we were all dead, he said dreamily, me and Joe and Hugh and the rest. I might say, well, but one place as another. It was only moving till the time came to lay my bones beside Abby. I did not mind it. When they reached Hillsborough, he paid no great mind to what Joe intended, only followed, obedient and unthinking. Followed and walked the muddy streets, sparkling with broken glass from shattered windows, seen the torchlight and mobs, heard the shouts and screams, all quite unmoved. It was no but dead men, a rattle in their bones against one another, he said with a shrug. He was still for a moment, then turned his face to Jamie and looked long and earnestly up into his face. Is it so? Are ye dead too? One limp, calloused hand floated up from the red kerchief and rested lightly against the bone of Jamie's cheek. Jamie didn't recoil from the touch, but took MacLennan's hand and brought it down again, held tight between his own. Not yet. Aye, give it time, he said. He pulled his hands free and sat for a moment, smoothing his kerchief. His head kept bobbing, nodding slightly as though the spring of his neck had stretched too far. Give it time, he repeated. It's none so bad. He stood up then and put the square of red cloth on his head. He turned to me and nodded politely, his eyes vague and troubled. I thank you for the breakfast, ma'am, he said, and walked away. So we got to see two different sides of a coin. We get to see the MacGillivrays wanting to do anything to protect not only their son, but to protect their daughter's ability to wed into a good family. Like that, she's like, I will see them wed and wed well, and she will. She's going to broker good marriages for her daughters. And so we see that protectiveness to the point that they were willing to kill the thief taker. And that was serious. And then we see, on the other hand, Abel MacLennan, who participated in the riot, but he was numb. He just went along. He was caught up in the mob, in the moment, and he just went. Because he already felt like he was dead. He came too late and could not protect his wife. He came too late and she died while he had those 6 shillings in his pocket to pay for the taxes that now weren't owed because his home got auctioned. So he felt like a ghost already. His protectiveness gone. And so now he feels like a dead man walking. It's so sad. But we get to see both sides of this conflict that's coming. It just really breaks my heart reading this part. And I'm like, I'm surprised I didn't tear up. Because going through it, and imagine sitting around their fire, having breakfast, Marsali sitting there with her baby, and with Germain, and being left with that story. How do you think that is going to affect Claire and Jamie in the future? How do you think that's going to affect how Marsali sees things? I mean, that has to have impact when personal stories come to you about situations, then it becomes real because it becomes part of life and you can actually understand why somebody's so angry, why the things happen, and why people react how they do in these situations. I mean, I sit there and I think of how we are so overly taxed in so many ways. And the American Revolution was fought for various reasons, but what they believed to be out of control taxation was one of the reasons that it happened, along with autonomy and not wanting the government or to have undue control over the people. So there's lots and lots of reasons, and I'm glad we actually get to discuss them as the books go forward. It's actually a really good insight to the American Revolution and what led up to it, because we do have Diana input personal accountings, things that we will find to be realistic in the situation and that can actually connect us to the events. Because for a lot of people, history, they think is boring, which I don't understand. I love history. However, a lot of people don't feel that way. And so until you can find a reason to connect to it and to have people experience it, like just reading that, I could feel what he was feeling. I could see what was happening. I could see these mob of men going down the street and breaking windows and doing all of these heinous acts and running the law out of town. I can see it happening, and it makes sense why it happened. And there is something called the mob mentality, where you just get thrown into it and it becomes a force to itself. And it's almost like people can't help it. It's like that bloodlust that men get in war, especially when we're seeing hand-to-hand combat war. They get filled with that almost blood rage kind of thing, and that's all they see. That's what they know. It's really easy. So when we hear about these heinous things that happen when groups of people get together today, the 21st century, it is so shocking. We like to think we are above that as humans. We are not above it. Mob rule happens all the time. And there's a reason why good people who generally you're like, hey, that's good people, get caught up into things they would never normally do. And it doesn't matter if there's alcohol or drugs. It just can be a group of people. And the swirling thing starts. And one person starts and everybody gets caught up in it. And they do atrocious, heinous things. I don't know what it is about humans that causes that. But we really get reduced to the baser self. And it's terrible. We are not above it. And this Abel MacLennan, who was just numb and grieving and just went along. Okay. And that's really how it happens. So I'm going to step back for a second and talk about one of the herbals that Claire was talking about, which is ergot. And getting affected with ergotism is pretty serious. You hallucinate incredibly, and it's the little fungus that can grow on, say, on corn, on grain, and you have to be really, really careful about eating it and ingesting it. However, ergot was used medicinally, and as Claire brings up, for menstruation, that kind of thing. It was actually first used to precipitate childbirth and is found in the notes of a physician from Frankfurt named Adam Lonitzer. I can't pronounce that correctly. In 1582, so quite a long time ago. It has been used prior to that by midwives, but it wasn't until 1808 that it came into what we now have as Western medicine. However, ergot wasn't used very long because it would cause excessive contractions and it could be fatal to the baby. So we don't want that. That's the same thing. Misoprostol is known to do that in labor as well, to increase contractions uncontrollably in some women to where there can be uterine ruptures and there can be maternal and or fetal deaths. There can be both, and there have been. That's why it's a very scary drug to use for labor induction because it is not controllable once it's in the system. And we don't know. It can be a good last effort if used very judiciously, if it's between a vaginal delivery or going straight to a cesarean. Guarding a vaginal delivery as a last effort, great. But it cannot be used on women who have uterine scarring, as in a prior cesarean or other uterine surgeries, because it's known to cause uterine ruptures. So anyway, that's like the more modern version. But ergot is very dangerous, and so it would not be something that in Claire's time would have been used at all for anything related to menstruation or pregnancy. Just so you know. I did put links in for how this works. And actually, it's the history of LSD, which is what we call acid, is, though it's synthetic, its basis is designed from ergot and how this worked. Okay, there was something else. All right. So I also put links in for the anthelmintic herbs, just in case you have to deworm a dog or something, because I put one in for animals, a study, and also for humans. You know, nicely in the Western world, we don't normally get attacked with intestinal worms. However, they do happen still. So I, love these kind of links and love to be able to look at the other medicine systems that Claire has to participate in order to do her job well as a healer in the 18th century, because she doesn't have all the modern day things. The other part of looking at the links I put in about abortifacients and emmenagogues, some can be used both ways. Again, can be very dangerous after a certain point in pregnancy. However, when we're looking at chemical abortifacients that we use now, which is the RU486, and it has misoprostol and other medications in it, they can only be used for a limited time period in pregnancy as well, because they can cause serious bleeding and other issues and aren't as effective. So they can cause a lot of problems maternally. So there you have it. I'm not going to go into detail, but I did pull up North Carolina history, and it's the North Carolina History Project, actually. And they talk about the regulators and the Hillsborough riot in 1770. So during the late 1760s, the regulators really started gaining ground, and they protested political corruption, excessive legal fees, cronyism, I like that word. And they actually did confront Governor William Tryon and Edmund Fanning and the militia in 1768. But at that one, there was no violence that occurred because the militia lacked a legal excuse to attack. Okay? But the Hillsborough riot of 1770 did make news. It was definitely noteworthy. So after the first protest a couple of years prior, the governing body didn't do anything to heed and fix what the regulators complained about. So the regulators refused to pay taxes. They continued to refuse. And on September 22nd, 1770, so this was a month before the gathering, so this has just happened in the weeks prior, it did become violent. So I'm just going to read this. Regulators assembled in Hillsborough in a way that North Carolinians had historically practiced to disrupt the court and bring attention to political demands. All was peaceful until March 26, a Monday, when regulators, armed with clubs and whips, packed the courthouse and asked to be jury members. They debated for approximately 30 minutes before the court continued without regarding their requests. So there were frustrated regulators outside who attacked a lawyer named Williams, we don't know the first name, and then re-entered the courthouse. They seized Fanning and beat him. So both men escaped, but were soon found, okay? And they made agreements with the regulators so that they could go home, but they were under duress. And the judge, Henderson, continued holding court and promised to continue doing so the next day. That night, however, he fled town. So this means the regulators were extra frustrated and targeted Fanning. They ran him out of town, plundered his home, marched with his effigy through Hillsborough, destroyed a church bell donated by him, and ended their violence by breaking merchants' house windows. The actions of the regulators reveal how riots of the 1700s defy modern-day definitions of riot. According to historian Wayne E. Lee, the regulators were legitimate in a way that uncontrolled havoc is not. The regulators acted out of a need to have specific demands met. Fanning could have been killed, but he was not. Regulators could have destroyed the courthouse, but they did not. They did not practice indiscriminate violence and called for a restoration of what they considered order and just rule. In eastern North Carolina, a modern definition of riot emerged, for in part, government officials and absentee landowners, argue historians, feared the social leveling effect of the riot. Sensational news stories overemphasized the violence. Reports ignored the traditional components of the so-called riot and that regulators called for order and not a revolution. News stories demonized the regulators, castigated them as traitors, and thereby depicted them as outlaws who did not deserve the application of long-standing rules. A justified retaliation was ordered, argued government authorities. The stories describing the regulator protests also fostered a willingness among many North Carolinians to accept military violence to suppress the regulator rebellion and even volunteer for the militia. At the Battle of Alamance, 1771, the militia quelled the regulator protest. We will get to the Battle of Alamance. So it looks like the dates in here are interesting. So there you have it. I just read from the North Carolina History Project. So it was a very real thing. And Diana just takes it and totally puts it into context. So the other question that you may have is, what is an astrolabe? So the oldest one known, and this is from the University of Hawaii, was a few centuries BC, possibly Hipparchus. They were made more more complex throughout So I'm going to start this over. What is an astrolabe? It's a two-dimensional model of the celestial sphere. The name has its origins from the Greek words astron and lambanian. Okay, meaning the one who catches the heavenly bodies. An astrolabe is an instrument that once was the most used, multi-purpose astronomical instrument. Historically, astrolabes were elaborately inscribed brass discs. The portability and usefulness of an astrolabe made it something like the multi-purpose laptop computer of our predecessors. With an astrolabe, an astronomer can make quite accurate measurements of the following things. Potential, position of celestial objects. Measure the time of night or of the day using it as a mobile sundial, or more accurately by measuring the altitude of the sun. Measure the time of the year. Compute what part of the sky is visible at any time. Determine the altitude of any object over the horizon. Determine the current latitude. And determine very accurately the NPS orientation. There you have it. And apparently, Geoffrey Chaucer in 1392 wrote one of the best descriptions of what an astrolabe is and what it's used for. Fabulous. So this article that I've linked in here actually describes exactly how it's made and put together and what it does. Now, so what exactly is Jamie going to use it for on the ridge? What do you think? If you can look at altitudes and time of year and time, I don't remember from the book what he uses it for. And since I'm doing the read along with you, I'm not going to look ahead. I'm like, we're going to discover it together. Okay. So that's that. So what do you think of how Diana wrote about these real things that happened? I mean, what do you think about Abel MacLennan's story? Do you feel like that is something that is reasonable? Or her take about Joe Hobson being so angry that they just took out like a mob? Because in the article I read to you, they were calling for order. And they weren't just a riot. So it makes me wonder. Because in the book, it really doesn't give the idea that they were really seeking order. And they wanted things to be returned to as they were, and they wanted a reduction in these fees. And they wanted everybody to stop being corrupt. We see some of that in the books, like much more than on the TV show. Didn't even barely touch on it. I didn't describe it as a way of, no, we want to fix stuff. We want it to come back to normal because they are out of control. Even though they said they were out of control, we didn't really get the other side of that very effectively. At least in my opinion, as it be. So what do you think about these exchanges? About Jamie demonstrating his ability so well? How do you think that's going to garner him favor or make people jealous? Like, what do you think that's going to do to impact how people see him? And I love how Claire just like ran along because she really wanted to know what was what. And she's using like subtlety to teach the apothecary things. I found it fascinating. And that John Quincy Myers would call Jamie Roy as well. It's like he's picked up on some of the Ardsmuir sayings, knowing these families. And he knows a lot of them because he trades in furs and other things, right? And he's a very complex and interesting character. And what do you think the purpose was for the discussion of Marsali's cracked nipples? Is it just a vehicle to move the story? So it would give Abel MacLennan something to talk about I mean, I think it's fascinating that he would address them at all and say anything. But it did open up to them talking and having that whole story revealed from his vantage point, which I found very endearing. And I also think that Diana just puts in breastfeeding. I think she's very pro breastfeeding. So she puts in aspects of reality and real life with a baby, unlike what other authors might do. She does. So next week, we are going to be covering chapters 3 and 4 in this incredibly long day. I can't imagine at, 9 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, being left with the impression that Abel MacLennan left. It's fascinating and horrible at the same time. Okay, so would you have edited any of these pieces out of this chapter? Did anything seem like it just didn't belong to you? Was anything confusing to you? I just wish we could see more of Uta MacGillivray. I like her a lot. And I want to see more of her. She's a very interesting lady. Fierce. She's a fierce woman. And I also like, as we're barely getting into this book, that we get to see the dimensions of Claire. We get to see her and Jamie taking turns and being in their own elements, them being themselves. One does not overshadow the other one. They really are partners, and they get to thrive in the relationship. Whatever they need to do, they do with the other person's support, but it's not to the detriment of the other. They both can be leaders. They both can do things that need to be done. They both can save the day. They both can sit back and while the other one takes the lead. I mean, that is some of the charm of this couple, of the relationship, and what we love about it so much is that they really do work in concert. They work for each other mostly. Yeah, they both make dumb decisions sometimes. And trouble's always finding them, or them finding trouble. But there's an equality between them that is unlike much of what we see, and there's a brutal honesty that often doesn't exist. And we get to see the details of them when we get it from the written page. And we can really look at them in multiple dimensions and not simply as Claire's a physician and she's fixing everything all the time. We get to see her in her element, but she's not being a T-Rex and taking everything over. And Jamie's, whatever, that's her element. And he goes and does his own thing, even if she's like, what's happening? This is scaring me. And I like the fact that there's a fragility to Claire. Like, there's a part of her that worries. And there's a part of her in the books where she is scared and she's vulnerable. And we get to touch that humanity in her in the books, where she's just not strong. And there's a vulnerability to Jamie as well, but it doesn't take away from his strength and his courage and the things that he does either. It actually bolsters him. It's not a weakness. It's very much a strength of his. But he doesn't do a good job displaying that when he's not with Claire. She nurtures that part of him, and she nurtures his ability to take care of himself and not just have a purpose for others only. Okay. I am going to look at comments. This is a very long podcast, so my apologies if you're tired of listening already. I'm going to grab some comments. All right, so the most shocking comment that I got was on YouTube and was asked if I think they're even going to cover The Gathering in Season 5. That comment came from Jamie Johnson, and I was so shocked. It hadn't even occurred to me that that was even a possibility. But you know what? It's totally a possibility. They could have everything happen at Fraser's Ridge instead. I mean, anything of importance can happen on the Ridge or at Jocasta's at River Run. I am dumbfounded. I don't even know what to say about that. But they could. They could have all these things combined and we would not see The Gathering at all. What do you guys think about that? That kind of blew my mind a lot. And this is where we can enter into the, how do you think the show is going to do this material? So that one completely blew my mind. I've had people say that there's no way that Jocasta is going to marry Murtaugh now that they are seemingly a romantic couple, because Jocasta needs to marry up or marry somebody who is not going to be in trouble with the law. And Murtaugh, could he offer that? I mean, he does have his smithy, or does he still have it? We have no idea. He hasn't been there in a long time. Who's running it for him? So, I don't know if they're going to do this in the show or not. All of it could be absolutely converted to events that could be at the Ridge. They could have soldiers come there. I don't know. What do you think? I have no idea. And do you think that show Jocasta will marry Murtaugh? Because in the book, she's supposed to be marrying Duncan Innes, who doesn't exist. And he could be her manager, and it was a very solid business arrangement for both of them. It was not a love match. So, that's a little piece of intrigue there. Are we going to actually see the effects of the Hillsborough riot? Are we going to get the stories? Are we going to see the near apprehension of people who were there? Or are we going to see it simply through the eyes of Murtaugh because Jamie's supposed to hunt him down and kill him because he's considered a fugitive for his regulator activities and escaping jail? We'll see. I don't know. It'll, based on the Murtaugh storyline alone, The Gathering could be completely unnecessary for much of what we're seeing about the regulators in the Hillsborough riot. They're writing it right now. I don't know what to think about it. So, in the context of the story, what do you think these different things mean? It's fascinating. I mean, are these amenagogues going to come up again? I don't know. We'll have to see. I don't remember every detail about the Fiery Cross, though I've read it multiple times. These are very big books, and it's always fun to do the read-alongs because for me, it's an awakening to the story in a way that I've not read them before, because I have to stop and really take time and pause and reflect upon what I'm reading in a way that casual reading does not do. All right. So I thank you so much for listening, and I know this is incredibly long, and please come over to Facebook if you're on social media and ask to join the Facebook group, A Dram of Outlander. You have to answer a few questions and come on in. And there's the Facebook page. And then on Twitter and Instagram, it's Dram of Outlander. And of course, the website is adramofoutlander.com. And I'm working on a piece about Roger and Brianna's path to love and the path to the season finale from the TV show. So if you have any thoughts about that path, please let me know this week, and I will maybe include it in what I'm writing. It's just taken me a while to conceptualize it completely because there's a lot. And I wanted to, again, say thank you to Kathy and Knits for the Outlander-inspired giveaway. It was a good success, and I'm very excited to have connected you with our winner. I hope we get a picture of the shawl after it arrives. And lastly, how do you support the podcast? Well, you support the podcast by going into iTunes for Apple Podcast and giving a rating, or to Spotify, or any of the other ways that you stream the podcast, and give a rating, because I know in iTunes through Apple Podcasts, every 5-star rating helps people find me. And of course, I would love to grow the show even more. The other way that you can support the podcast is financially through patreon.com/adramofoutlander. Or if you want to do an individual offering, you can just let me know and I will tell you how to do that. And I did want to give a shout out today for someone for becoming a monthly Patreon subscriber. And so thank you, Don Ruminski, for doing a monthly offering. I appreciate you greatly. And stay tuned. There will be cute little A Dram of Outlander giveaways for those who donate to the podcast. So I appreciate you, and I thank you for listening, and I want to hear from you. Contact at adramofoutlander.com or 719-425-9444. And thank you for nobody faxing my business fax after I accidentally gave my fax number as the call-in number. I fixed it at the end of the podcast, but that was pretty funny. I couldn't remember where I said it in the podcast, so I couldn't go back and edit it out. I didn't write it down. Normally I make notes as I'm recording, so I can go back and fix stuff. So thank you very much, and until next time, Slán Живá.